Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to dig into what happens when fair housing practices are really put to the test. We're looking at a case file from HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Yeah, this one really gets into the nitty-gritty of these kinds of situations. We're
Yeah.
talking allegations, evidence, and ultimately a decision straight from HUD.
At the center of it all is Shawna Fredericks, who bought a house in Baltimore back in 2017. What makes this case interesting is that her purchase was part of a huge redevelopment project, Station East, right?
Right, Station East, it was all about revitalizing a historic area. These projects often use things like the Maryland Historic Tax Credit to get going.
Tax credits, so like a financial incentive for developers.
Exactly. It encourages developers to take on these big rehab projects, breathe some life back into these old buildings by giving them tax breaks.
Makes sense, but you said there's a catch. What's the downside for the homeowner?
Well, sometimes, and this is where it gets interesting, these agreements involve the homeowner, in this case, Shauna, forwarding part of their tax credits back to the developers.
Hold on, so it's not as simple as just buying a home in a revitalized neighborhood. The homeowner is actually part of this bigger financial arrangement.
That's exactly it. And this is where things get even more complicated, because Shauna alleged she was being treated unfairly compared to other homeowners in Station East, specifically because of her race.
So when you say unfairly, are we talking about how these tax credit agreements were being enforced?
Yes, she felt like she was being singled out as an African-American homeowner. She claimed other homeowners weren't being held to the same obligations when it came to those tax credits.
Did she specify why she felt this was happening? What were her specific concerns?
Well, she also alleged there were delays and just a lot of difficulty in getting home warranty repairs done. She felt like this was another example of potential bias.
So we're potentially talking about violations of the Fair Housing Act, which is why HUD got involved.
Right.
What exactly were they looking for when they started their investigation?
Basically, HUD needed to figure out if there was enough evidence to back up Shauna's claims of discrimination. They looked into the tax credit agreements for everyone who bought a home in Station East.
In Station East, that wasn't a small development, was it? Seems like a lot to investigate.
You're right, it was a big one. 40 homes, all kinds of different residents. It wasn't just a quick glance at some paperwork, it was a real deep dive into the entire project's documents and communications. And what they found really brings in some new angles to this story. Because it turns out most of the homeowners, no matter their race, had actually signed these agreements to forward their tax credits. It seemed like standard procedure at Station East.
Okay, so it sounds like this agreement was pretty common. Did HUD look into what it said? Was it super clear what homeowners were signing, or was there any room for interpretation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? That often comes up in cases like this. Now, to be honest, the specifics about how clear the language was, that would be in the detailed findings. But here's what's interesting. HUD actually found that other homeowners had also pushed back against forwarding those tax credits. Some of them weren't African American.
So it wasn't just Shauna who had a problem with this part of the agreement.
Exactly. It seems like maybe there were broader questions about that clause no matter who you were. But wait, there's more to it. Remember, Shauna also had those concerns about her home warranty and possible delays because of her race.
Right, that was a big part of her complaint, and a whole different issue from the tax credit situation. So what did HUD discover about those alleged delays?
This is where it gets a little tricky. See, HUD confirmed there was communication back and forth about the repairs, even that a neutral third party was brought in at one point. But they couldn't definitively link those issues or delays that Shauna faced to her race.
Okay, so to be clear about what we're seeing from HUD's investigation, we have these two main findings, right? One, the tax credit thing might have been confusing or even concerning for homeowners, but wasn't used against Shauna specifically because of her race. And two, while Shauna definitely had those home warranty issues, there wasn't enough to directly tie those problems to racial discrimination. Did I get that right?
You nailed it.
Yeah.
And, it brings up a really important point about fair housing complaints. Proving that someone intended to discriminate, that's the hard part.
Right, because even if something negatively affects someone of a certain race more often, that doesn't automatically mean it's a Fair Housing Act violation, does it?
Exactly. It's not just about showing there's a difference. It's about proving someone was treated differently because of their race.
Which I imagine is much harder to prove.
Yeah.
So where does all this leave Shauna then? What's the takeaway for someone listening? What does it even mean that HUD dismissed her complaint?
Great question. And it's something that can be easily misinterpreted. Just because HUD dismissed the complaint, it doesn't mean Shawna's concerns were meaningless or that what she went through wasn't frustrating. It just means that based on everything they looked at, HUD couldn't definitively say, yes, there was a Fair Housing Act violation in this specific situation.
So it's not about whether bias existed, really, but more about whether HUD had enough to say for sure that a law was broken. Man, that's got to be tough, not just for the person making the complaint, but for anyone listening who's been there.
Oh, absolutely. And this case is like a textbook example of just how complicated these fair housing cases can get.
Yeah.
Even when there's not a slam dunk violation, you still have these big questions about power dynamics, transparency, and how these huge redevelopment projects impact people.
Especially with these public-private partnerships, right? You've got developers who are usually very familiar with all these legal agreements, and then homeowners who might be totally new to this.
Exactly. And that can be tricky to navigate, especially if you're a first-time buyer or maybe you're unfamiliar with things like this Maryland historic tax credit.
So for our listeners out there thinking about buying a home in one of these redeveloped areas, what should they be thinking about? What can they learn from Shawna's experience?
Knowledge is power. Do your homework. If you're looking at a redevelopment project, especially if it involves tax credits or incentives, make sure you really get what the fine print says. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If something isn't clear, ask for clarification. You might even want to have a real estate attorney or someone who can advocate for you look over those documents.
Like having an expert guide to walk you through it all, right?
Okay.
They can help with the legal stuff, make sure your interests are taken care of, and really just make sure you're comfortable.
You got it. And remember, you always have the right to negotiate. Don't be afraid to ask for what you need. Buying a home, that's a big deal, and you have every right to understand everything and feel good about it before you sign on the dotted line.
Definitely better to be safe than sorry with something this big.
100%. You got to look out for yourself. And that's true even after you've bought the place.
Right, like what happened to Shauna with those home warranty repairs. Even though HUD didn't find a direct link to discrimination, she still had those problems and frustrations to deal with.
Exactly. You hit a snag, you have concerns, don't sit on them. Talk to someone, the developer, the warranty company, even HUD, if you think your fair housing rights are being trampled on.
Communication is key, it seems. And it's not just about knowing your rights, it's about actually using them, right? Speaking up for yourself throughout the entire process.
You said it. And that's where knowing about those resources, those organizations dedicated to fair housing, that can be a game changer. They can give you advice, support, even legal help if you need it.
Yeah, so even if our listeners aren't in Shauna's exact situation, her case shows how crucial it is to have those resources available. Everyone should be able to navigate these situations.
Absolutely. And when you take a step back, cases like this, even when there's no clear-cut Fair Housing Act violation, they can really shine a light on those deeper issues within these massive redevelopment projects. You know, the need for more transparency, for making sure everyone's treated equally.
It reminds us that we can still learn a lot from stories like Shauna's, even without that gotcha moment. It makes you think about who holds the power, who has access to what information, and how we can make sure everyone's on a level playing field, especially in these big projects.
We couldn't have put it better myself. These situations, they're rarely black and white. It's through really thinking about them, talking about them openly, that we can start to figure out solutions that benefit everyone, from the people buying homes to the community as a whole.
This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. Big thanks to our expert for walking us through this case and shedding some light on the world of fair housing. We really appreciate your insights.
Happy to be here. These conversations are so important. I always love learning from you and our listeners. It's a team effort.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into fair housing and redevelopment. We encourage you to keep learning about this stuff. Remember, knowledge is power. If you want to dig deeper, we've got links to resources and more information on our website. Until next time, stay curious, everyone.